Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, Melbourne limps to the finish line with lockdown restrictions set to ease from Friday. Meanwhile, a COVID positive escapee sparks a fresh crisis all the way up on Queensland's Sunshine Coast. The Prime Minister calls for a renewal of the liberal rules-based international order as he prepares to take his message to the G7. And mice on the march, New South Wales school teachers, unite to get rid of their schools of rodents. Oh, collective attack of the willies at home. Joining me on the panel, former New South Wales Nationals Minister and Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Australia's Academic and Research Network, Katrina Hodgkinson. Great to see you.
Hi, Ellen.
In Canberra, Managing Editor at the ANU's Australian Centre on China in the World, Jiang. Good to see you, Yun.
Hello.
About to be released in Melbourne, cross-cultural consultant Tasneem Chopra. Freezing cold, but you get to leave the building.
Hi, Ellen.
And also in Melbourne tonight, Victoria's Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, Mohammed. Thanks so much for joining us, Justin.
Thank you.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. Greater Melbourne will come out of lockdown at midnight tomorrow, but this outbreak is far from over. Thousands of close contacts are still isolating, awaiting test results, and there will remain widespread restrictions across the state. Travel from Melbourne to regional areas is off limit. Visitors won't be allowed into homes and outdoor gatherings will be capped. But there is good news. Schools will start back up from Friday and restaurants and cafes are reopening.
Everyone should be absolutely proud of what we've all achieved together. But we know that this isn't over yet, and until we have widespread vaccination across Victoria and across our country, the virus will still be with us. So we cannot let complacency creep in, and I'm asking everyone to keep doing the right thing.
According to the state's Chief Health Officer, this outbreak won't be over until they can be assured there are no more cases anywhere in Victoria.
Our national strategy of aggressive suppression is there for a reason. If you don't get to zero, there's no grumbling along with one or two cases. This started with one case in Wallet that has led to almost 100 cases over a period of a few weeks. So we absolutely have to drive back down to zero. That's been the national strategy for a reason.
Now, meanwhile, Queensland authorities have confirmed a positive case from someone who drove from Victoria to Queensland more than a week ago.
The woman is 44 years old and has travelled from Victoria through New South Wales into Queensland, arriving in Queensland on the 5th, travelling through areas of Queensland up to the Sunshine Coast and residing at Caloundra with family members and her husband. The woman was tested yesterday and was confirmed today that it is a positive case.
And the focus will now fall on a number of exposure sites in New South Wales and Queensland. So let's start with that. You're very familiar with regional New South Wales. Katrina, there's a great big long list there. Have I got that right? Gillenbar, Forbes...
Well, it's Narrandera.
It's really Narrandera, isn't it? Caltex at Narrandera, Forbes, Dubbo, Moree, all of these places, which are quite big centres, who've never really... And then up into Goondiwindi and then through to the Sunshine Coast, Moffat's Beach. Not places that have really had to deal with COVID scares, I think.
I think a couple of them in the Central West have had a couple of cases earlier on, you know, in the pandemic, but certainly it's not something that I think country people have been that worried about lately because it's been all about Victoria, hasn't it? And this is one that's clearly got away, and it just goes to show how vigilant we all have to be and really respect those rules that are put into place by the authorities. Like if you've been asked not to leave the state for 14 days, then you know, by and large, that's exactly what you should be doing, paying attention to that, because now what happens if it gets away in Queensland again and spreads like wildfire? What happens if it gets away in New South Wales? It's as easy as that. And, you know, for heaven's sake, people who haven't had their vaccination yet that are entitled to should now absolutely go and get their shot. I can't stress that firmly enough. I had my AZ a few weeks ago as soon as it was available, and I think it's a responsible thing for everybody to be doing, particularly the over 50s that can now go and get their AZ shots, to absolutely be going and doing it, because it's only by getting that sort of herd immunity that we're really going to put this thing at bay.
It'd be interesting to see supplies to these areas as well. Do you have any information on that sort of thing? Is it easy to get a shot in the central west of New South Wales? You may not know.
I don't know, but I know that the vaccinations, you don't have to pay for them.
Yeah.
You know, you can get them, the government is sponsoring this program, and, you know, I'm sure that, you know, if people are thinking about doing it, just make an appointment and just go and get it done.
And meanwhile, Tasneem, I'd ask if it's a relief, but it seems there's quite a strict set of conditions that are going to continue for Victoria.
They are, but they're an improvement on what was. In the sense, there is more mobility. You can travel further. You can go out as long as you make a booking to hospitality venues. That level of mobility and freedom is back, and it's interesting because even these small mercies become much appreciated when you haven't had them, even for a week or 2 weeks. So it's sort of like, yay, I can drive 20 kilometres, or great, now I can dine in at Macca's if that's your thing. So there are options that weren't there before, and so there is a renewed appreciation for the little things. But I think, as was mentioned earlier in the footage, this aggressive lockdown and all these aggressive measures, they do have a silver lining. We do see the numbers go down, and Victorians know more than any other state that this hard lockdown business yields results, in the sense that, at one stage we were 700 cases a day, and then we managed to bring that down to 0. So it is possible. And when I think about these regional towns that have now been affected, and even though they are, some of them, as you said, larger centres, if they do adhere to the restrictions that are imposed on them, and they're smaller cities, then, you can be cautiously optimistic about the outlook for them to resume business as usual sooner rather than later.
And you're getting that impression, aren't you, that we're entering into this new phase? We're not in an ideal situation because we're not all vaccinated, but do you sense a greater degree of control, that there's a sort of a rhythm to it, that every 12 days or so the virus gets out of hotel quarantine? It does. And then tracking and tracing and lockdowns are shorter and more effective?
Yes. And the reality is, once our international borders do presumably open in about a year's time, say that's the case, we are going to be getting cases in, but our capacity to deal with them is so much more improved. The technology for tracking, the rules around quarantining and isolation, and the facilities for testing. And Victoria, again, we know that the rate of testing has been so high. The rate of vaccinations uptake has been half the nation's, just within Victoria. So the couple of those two things, in tandem with the fact that there are some restrictions in place, means that I feel the experience of lockdown this time round is so much less foreboding than it was a year ago, when there was hardly as much testing and no vaccinations on the horizon at all. So I feel that Victorians sense, as bad as this is, it's actually, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and that's an optimistic way of dealing with the situation.
Justin, from your vantage point, this has almost been a lockdown in free fall a bit, because there wasn't the job keeper and the job seeker and the sort of the nation in it together. It's been very much something Victorians have been trying to get through quickly. And gee, it's smashed people who've been lining up for support because they just can't pay their rent. They've used up all their reserves, if they had any.
Yeah, this is the fourth lockdown, as we keep referring to it as. It's it's the first couple, I suppose, Victoria, especially people in Melbourne. I've lived in Melbourne through all the lockdowns. Really took it as a challenge to make sure that we get it right, and I bided, I think, on a general pretty much really well with what was kind of spelled out by the government. But every time there's a new lockdown, the resilience that you had, the optimism that we can get through it and we can kind of make things better. This time around, it's probably just hit a little bit harder, and even though it's been a bit shorter, almost 1 week and then extended, I think it's really just taken the wind out of a lot of people, because a lot of them had a pretty difficult year last year with finances, just schooling from home, a lot of pressures that we were never used to doing. not seeing family, not being able to have that sort of regular contact or fly out or to leave the state, or even Melbourne, and then all of a sudden, bang, we're back in it. I think it has really just taken people, and it's probably pushing people to a point where it's like, we want to kind of get out of this. We know that it's a long road ahead, but it's been pretty tough for people that have been in Melbourne, it's particularly Melbourne, but Victoria over the last 12 months, and now going through this again. It's something which I think it has taken a toll on everyone.
We've got to sort of say it out loud. The AMA sort of said it out loud today, and other senior doctors. The bottom line here is that the priority system for vaccinating Australians, which was let's get the frontline workers, the quarantine workers, that worked, but then the workers in residential and aged care and disability care, let's get them done before the rest of the population. That priority system collapsed. It didn't work. National Cabinet's come out and said, let's just get it going, 40 to 49, let's go for it. But the AMA is saying, you've got to double back when you've got outbreaks every 12 days from hotel quarantine and vaccinate the most vulnerable. I mean, how do you reflect on how it's going?
Of course, we should vaccinate the people that are most vulnerable first. But the problem we are seeing is that there has been empty vaccination centres, that people who are eligible are not getting the vaccines. So in that context, it's better to get people who want to get vaccinated as well at that time when they are available, rather than waiting for everyone who is vulnerable to get vaccinated first. So I think that there needs two things need to be done. One is that we really need to push for people to get vaccinated. Unfortunately, there appears to be some hesitancy among some people to get vaccinated, and some due to misinformation, perhaps, and some due to some sense of complacency. They really need to get a message out that everyone needs to be vaccinated.
And I do think the issue with disability and aged care workers was very clearly understood, that they were having difficulty getting their hands on a vaccine, and there's been that twin issue, hasn't there, Katrina, with a kind of a hesitancy in the community. But of course, with these outbreaks, you really have to be sure that those people most likely to die from an outbreak are protected.
I know. I understand with the aged care thing as well, though. Quite often it's the personal preference of the families not to vaccinate.
I don't know that was the overwhelming problem. I think that was part of it.
Sometimes because of those issues with, with highly publicised cases in Europe where the elderly were getting vaccinated and not surviving. So I also heard somebody the other day say he was waiting for the Moderna to come to Australia, so therefore he wasn't going to get the AstraZeneca. And I said, why on earth would you wait? Get your AstraZeneca now. If you want to get revaccinated later, great. But, in the interests of everybody's health, for heaven's sake, just use the vaccine that we have now. And that really frustrates me when you've got people my age and, in that bracket, over 50s, that have got this vaccine available to them, that they're not taking it up on the excuse of they're waiting for a different vaccine to come in. I just think that that's just so irresponsible.
The voices of traumatised Aboriginal children are central to a new report tabled in Victoria's Parliament today. Their testimony was collected by the Commission for Children and Young People, which examined how youth justice is managed in the state and looks to reimagine it. The facts are bleak. First Nations children in Victoria are 10 times more likely to be under community supervision and 9 times more likely to be in detention. And yet, they make up less than 2% of Victoria's youth population. Contained in this report are stories of children tackled to the ground, kicked and stomped. The Drum's Stephanie Bolchi explains.
Under Acts of Parliament, I've tabled the following documents. The Commission for Children and Young People's report, Our Youth, Our Way.
Stories and experiences of the children overrepresented in the justice system were tabled in Parliament this morning. With it, a possum skin cloak that the Commission says was sewn from skins on which the stories of children and young people have been burnt.
We were kids. We didn't have any money, so I was stealing food for us to eat. And one of the other kids ran out of iron and couldn't walk.
This 15-year-old is one of 93 people interviewed about their experiences. Most had their first contact with police before they turned 14, and their interactions worsened over time. As a result, they mistrusted or disliked the force.
It was hard. Every time they saw me on the street, they'd search me and tell me they don't want me in their town.
Nearly 300 case files from young offenders were also examined. The majority had a history of trauma or abuse or had experienced family violence. They also had at least one family member who'd come into contact with the system.
Instead of being treated like a criminal, you could be treated like a person who has done the wrong thing.
My brother is 11 and he got remanded. No little kid should be arrested at that age. We need more say in the justice system.
The report found that despite some positive changes, a culture of over-policing and surveillance continues. Some discussed overt racism or abuse in police custody. Others serious allegations of sexual threats or being struck by batons. Data showed police are more likely to arrest and detain Aboriginal young people rather than caution them. Those kids would spend more days detained on average than non-Indigenous kids, and if they were granted bail, they are more likely to be found breaching it.
I started using drugs at 11 and I started getting into trouble. Just little stuff. And as soon as the police know you, that's it. It doesn't take much. They see you on the street, pull you over and harass you.
Half had a mental health condition and nearly a third had self-harmed or had suicidal thoughts or attempted suicide. Many told the Commission they had substance issues. Among the recommendations, the Commission called for the Parliament to legislate to authorise Aboriginal communities to design, administer and supervise key elements of the youth justice system. Better resources for Aboriginal-led organisations and more community-led initiatives for early intervention, as well as raising the minimum age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14.
Most people have a reason. They don't just go muck around for fun. Try and help them get better. Help them help themselves get better.
A commission that produced this report. So we'll start with you. It's very powerful, this report that you've produced, because it's personal accounts from these children themselves. Someone's taken the time to sit down and ask them the questions. What led you here? What's been your experience? Tell me about it.
Yeah, it's been a real journey. I mean, it's been a journey which opened up a lot of different conversations. With some of them we didn't even expect, as the inquiry was about over-representation and youth justice. But we heard about so many other areas around education, health, housing, feeling just safe within themselves, within their communities, etc. So when we started looking at how do we tackle this, how do we write a report which is going to address over-representation and youth justice, it's going to take more than just the youth justice. The Department for Youth Justice is going to take more than just the Victorian Police. It's going to take a whole wide range of departments and places where young people go through in life, in education, health, housing, etc., as I mentioned. But one of the things which was starkly, which I really hit home to me, is that I'm probably showing my age a little bit now, but 30 years ago I was a youth justice worker in Victoria and going around speaking with many young people back then 30 years ago. And sadly, the young people I spoke to just recently had similar things that they were telling me, which I heard 30 years ago. So in some ways things hadn't changed and they were going through these similar experiences. So for me, that means the system hasn't done enough. We haven't worked well enough to address the past to have a better future for our young people. And that's why this report is really challenging. We don't make any excuses or apologies for that. We want this to be challenging. We want to raise the bar on this, and we wanted to change this system that has not been able to deliver the results that we've all hoped for over many, many years. And this particular report, as mentioned, it is hearing young people's stories, and I don't want to kind of just say it was all deficit, because we built this on trying to understand what the young person's strengths are and where they want to go in life. And it is amazing, some of the stories of resilience and where they want to go and what they actually need in life isn't a great deal what they're looking for. But the system and all its goodwill and what it's wanting to do is just missing the mark, and hopefully this report will get it back on track.
And it was sort of reading the quotes in the report of what these young people told you all, and you sort of started to imagine this sometimes pre-teenage child, and there's a sense of a sort of a horrible inevitability to their lives, and what's absent is care and love, that they, from the system, from itself, you know, there's a caring responsibility that the state takes on. So you've got kids who are twice as likely to experience psychological distress. Half of them have got a mental health condition. A third of them have self-harmed. They hurt themselves in this distress, right? And so there's a caring responsibility when the state takes them on. And what do they get? They get a revolving door of youth justice case managers, and they get put in a setting that resembles kind of jail, where they can't even get an education. And you've also uncovered that some of them say they haven't got access to essential medical care, and they're being physically and verbally abused.
Yeah, this is where we wanted to make sure that we heard the voice of the young people, and a lot of the times when we try to address issues that are affecting young people, we lead them out of the conversation and we miss some very important details with things that are very important to them that we can often overlook as adults or people that work in the system. So together with what we heard from young people, collectively what we was able to grab out of the data and the research which has happened for over many years, what we've looked around the world at other jurisdictions internationally, how they've addressed and are addressing their issues around, especially First Nations young people in being overrepresented. We've been able to pull together this report to realise that it's going to take more than one area to fix this. It's going to take more than just one person or one region, but there's got to be something which can be done collectively and provide a network of supports and protection for young people. So when all young people, we all make mistakes when we're younger, and we'll continue to do so. When these young people make mistakes, they can't break this cycle because there is very little support for them around this, and that's what we're wanting to do, so kids don't fall through the cracks that are there, that they can be picked up and they can break that cycle and move on and move out. Just wanting to say one final thing is, in all of this, we realise that Aboriginal culture is paramount. It's something which needs to be centrally placed, and many of the young people said that when they didn't have this, they didn't have any gauge or any sort of true north that they could go to. But when they had programs, when they had the connection back to community, back to their family, back to culture, that they were able to move forward and feel stronger and get better and be able to become a stronger and more resilient young people. But the system itself at the moment, it has made some vast steps in the right direction, but we've still got these rates, these figures we're still vastly overrepresented in every area of youth justice. And I believe that this is a time for change to make this happen. We're hoping Victoria as a state can be the leader in this, not only just for our state, but for nationally, that we can actually see a real positive and actually close the gap in a particular area which has been on the national agenda for decades and decades.
Tasneem, the report not only says, look, police, the way they're set up at the moment, are not suited to this, and the Commission's very pointedly said that what these young children are talking about is being over-policed, is once they're picked up for something, there's an inevitability about it. The police are going to pull them over every time, the behaviour escalates and it all feeds into each other. And also that putting them in a jail-like circumstance when they've got significant mental health issues and their schooling's interrupted and all the rest of it, it doesn't achieve anything at all. But also what they've pointed out, and this seems to me like something that needs to be dealt with in the next 12 hours, is children saying, and Justin will correct me if I'm wrong, that somewhere in the system, whether it's police or inside youth justice, that multiple officers will tackle a child or young person to the ground, that they've experienced sexual threats, that they've experienced striking with batons and kicking and stomping. So that's what they're talking about, this sort of active abuse by authorities, including they say broken bones.
Wow. The report was staggering and the outcomes completely unacceptable. I mean, I think we can all agree on that. In terms of where to from here, yes, the recommendations are there, and as Justin said, we've kind of been lamenting this issue for decades, and the difference here being that young people's voices are informing the solutions-based response that they're looking to, which I think is, again, not new, because we know that First Nations communities have been the ones best placed to manage their communities and to deal with the issues that they've inherited from as a legacy of, a colonialism for the last 200 years. And so much of the trauma that is ongoing is in part something that the state is culpable for, but communities themselves have the capacity to address. So it's just the resources that they lack and the legitimacy to actually make those implementations. So that is nothing. That's not again something that should be negotiated. There's no grey area there. It's very, very clearly both the advice of Indigenous leaders in the space and professionals in the sector as well. In terms of the police attitudes, cultural competence deficit comes to mind straight away. The fact that it's not being either delivered or not being actioned upon, I think that demands action and demands a response from policing authorities in the state, because that level of abuse, if it was perpetrated against non-Indigenous communities, wouldn't see the light of day.
Katrina, you've worked as a local member to try and get the sort of programs that Justin wants escalated, right? So the Commission's talking about community-based Koori Youth Justice programs, Koori Youth Justice workers, and he wants that all really well funded. But you just banged your head against a brick wall, didn't you?
Well, Justice Reinvestment was the name of the program that Dr Jill Guthrie from the ANU put together for the town of Cowra in the Central West. And there was a group formed consisting of local government, myself, community leaders, that we tried to work hard to get this program up and running. I mean, there's an amazing sense of community in Cowra. In fact, in most country towns, you've got fantastic community assets and assistance there. So, we wanted to do it locally, develop programs for early intervention, and particularly to stop this sort of thing from happening. I mean, we got rid of orphanages for a reason, but why do we still have this system of GV justice in this nation? I mean, it's not fair. It's not fair on kids. I'm a mum, you're a mum, lots of parents watching. I hate the thought that if my son did something wrong, I mean, he's a good boy, he wouldn't do something wrong, but if he did, you got in with the wrong crowd and he ended up institutionalised, I mean, I'd be absolutely heartbroken. It must be heartbreaking for the families involved with these cases. And it is time for a fundamental policy shift in this area. The police are doing their job as it's put to them, and the system is in place. But it's time for a fundamental rethink on exactly how we make sure that regional kids in particular get that early intervention and aren't forced away from their families.
Justin, can I come back to you? There's really key recommendations. We heard in the setup package a child as young as 11 locked up. The recommendation's really stark. No one under the age of 16 to be locked up. But I want to end this segment, if I can. There was something very poignant that you were talking with us about earlier. You said to the kids, what do you want? What do you want? And there was such a beautiful and heartbreaking answer from them about the simplicity of what it is that these young kids want. Take the time to tell me what they said.
Yeah, it was quite moving, and we've heard it over and over again. Some of the basic things, or some of the things that these young people, when we pose that question to them, you'd think they're asking for the world, but they're asking for things like, a bed they can safely sleep in for the night, someone that they can call on when they are in time of need or they need that support, someone they can trust, someone they have to repeat their story to every time. And some of these young people come from very traumatic backgrounds of being removed from their families at very early ages. They mentioned the word just want to be loved, want to be cared for, want to feel protected. a lot of these young people, and I know sometimes people can't understand it. They'll say things like, we've got to be protected, we've got to come down hard on crime. These young people, aren't safe to be walking around the streets with, because they put up people at danger. But these young people, they don't feel protected, they don't feel safe themselves, and because a lot of them have been living life day by day and just trying to move forward. And I want to go back to a point which was mentioned just earlier, is that some of our young people, Aboriginal young people that are in the youth justice system, that are incarcerated, that have been locked up or put on remand, the reason they're in there because there is no other place for them to be bailed to, or to have a safe place. And it's not like, well, where else that they've offended, they've come in contact with the police. The police don't have much of an option out there for them either, so they find themselves in a youth justice centre. If it was your child or my child, they wouldn't even see a day inside the centre for exactly the same behaviour. And that's where I think we've got a really great opportunity here to make these changes. These young people, most of them want to move forward. Most of them have said to me when I've spoken to them that they've messed up, and if they had their time again, they would turn this around. But they want to move forward, they want to reconnect, and they want to move on with life like any other young person can do. And our report will hopefully be picked up. Hopefully we'll be able to be embedded, to be able to make these brave and courageous changes that's needed, and that we'll be able to change the experiences of young people when the times in their life when they do mess up or they do make a wrong turn somewhere, that they aren't being treated in a system which is going to make them keep coming back through that revolving door. They'll be able to move in and move out in a stronger and more resilient manner. And that's where it is. I believe our report pushes this. It needs that piece of work should not be done by the justice system, but by community, and the community should be resourced to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's very powerful to listen to the voices of children. It's a really positive report. They tell us what they want. They want to be loved. I love this comment. We've stuffed up. Maybe we will again, but we need somebody in our lives to love us and care for us, and that refers to the system too. Thanks for telling us all about it, Justin. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And
if this topic has raised any issues for you, please call Lifeline on 131114 or Beyond Blue 1300 22 4636. You're watching The Drum, and with me on the panel are former New South Wales Nationals Minister and Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Australia's Academic and Research Network, Katrina Hodgkinson. In Canberra tonight, Managing Editor at the ANU's Australia Centre on China in the World, Jiang. In Melbourne, cross-cultural consultant Tasneem Chopra. And also in Melbourne tonight, Victoria's Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, Mohammed. When the history books are written, it may not be the economic upheaval or scientific breakthroughs that end up dominating the period we're living through, but rather the growing gulf between China and Australia. A diplomatic reckoning years in the making, the pandemic accelerated the loosening of ties all the way to export bans and communication breakdowns that we'll continue to feel for years. And when Scott Morrison meets with the most powerful world leaders later this week, he'll be asking them to focus on this. He's used a speech made just prior to his departure to the G7 meeting in Britain to focus the mind, saying we are living through a level of uncertainty unseen in decades.
The American scholar Robert Kagan warned, and I've referred to this in other remarks, the jungle is growing back. And as leaders of some of the world's largest liberal democracies and advanced economies, we must tend to the gardening with renewed clarity, unity and purpose. Our challenge is nothing less than to reinforce, renovate and buttress a world order that favours freedom. Now, meeting this challenge will require an active cooperation amongst like-minded countries and liberal democracies not seen for 30 years.
And the Prime Minister sees disruptions in trade as a threat to what he calls flourishing liberal democracies.
Competition does not have to lead to conflict, nor does competition justify coercion. We need all nations to participate in the global system in ways that foster development and cooperation. Australia stands ready to engage in dialogue with all countries on shared challenges, including China, when they're ready to do so with us.
For more on this, we're joined by Senior Lecturer on Modern Chinese History at the University of Sydney and author of The China Panic, David Brophy. Good to see you, David.
Hi, Ellen.
I've been very absorbed by your book, a really interesting perspective. You call yourself as much an Australia watcher as a China watcher. And I'm interested, when did this tone set in? Because you remind us in the introduction to the book that in the late 1990s it was John Howard who said, look, we don't have to choose between our history, meaning our history with Britain and the US, our history, and our geography here in the Asia Pacific. When did we get to the point where we felt we had to choose?
Well, in fact, you'll still find Australian politicians using those kinds of phrases when they talk about China occasionally. But I think we do know enough now to say that in 2017 there was quite a deliberate decision, particularly coming out of the intelligence agencies and the Prime Minister's office, to shift to a more confrontational stance on China. Viewers might remember the way the government seized on issues like the Dastyari scandal to introduce this new language of loyalty and betrayal. There was a lot of discussion of China undermining Australian sovereignty, even its independence, way of life, so on. Now the question is, what was motivating that turn at that point? Now, of course, there are some people who believe that China really was hell-bent on undermining Australian institutions. I'm not of that view. You also get a view from another direction that Australia was pushed into this confrontation by the United States, that Australia has essentially sort of ceded its decision-making on China to the US. And again,
because around that time, Trump's in the White House.
Yes.
And he's got all that anti-China stuff going on.
That's how Trump...
And then he's saying, and as for all you allies, you're a bunch of bums who don't pay your way. Well, now, you think that had an effect?
Yeah, I think, in fact, in the early phases of the Trump administration, there was a degree of pessimism in Canberra as to America's interest in maintaining its dominant status in East Asia, and therefore its relationship with countries like Australia, the alliance. And in fact, so I see Australia's response, in fact, as driven by a desire coming out of Canberra itself to stand up and demonstrate to America that Australia is willing to do more to participate in this confrontational turn towards China. You can think of it in some ways as a sort of a lobbying strategy, in fact, and I think we see that to the present day with Morrison's speech. He's very clearly interested in taking a message to the G7 that the focus should be on China, not on issues like climate change. He wants other countries to follow Australia down the path that Australia has pursued in the last 3 to 4 years. Otherwise, of course, Australia will be left isolated.
And here is the moment, around 2017, it's Malcolm Turnbull as the Prime Minister making the point, crystallising, in your view, this change in our policy from John Howard's stance, Tony Abbott's stance, we don't have to choose between our history and our geography, to a much more assertive stance on China. Here it is.
China was founded in 1949 with these words: Zhongguo Runmen Zanqi Lai. The Chinese people have stood up. It was an assertion of sovereignty. It was an assertion of pride. And we stand up. And so we say, Adalia Runmen Zanqi Lai. The Australian people stand up. The Chinese people stand up for their sovereignty, and they expect Australian people, and particularly Australian leaders, to stand up for theirs. That is why we respect each other.
Let me turn to you. You and I was watching your expression when you were listening to that. You know, we had reporters in who'd come back from China years after that going, you have no idea how much offence that has given. In David's book, what he's essentially saying is, you know, the China panic that we're seeing now is a product of us as it is a reaction to anything China has done. What do you think?
Well, definitely in a bilateral relationship, it's always a two-way street, right? The problem is, from China's perspective, we are just a small fish. We're a middle power, so it is easy to punish us, unlike the United States. And from Australia's perspective, we want to be seen as forward-leaning, to be countering China. And I think, as David mentioned before, it's almost a way to enmesh the United States in the region because we are afraid, because we're so dependent on the United States for the alliance, military alliance. So we are afraid that they are just going to leave the region. So there is the triangular relationship there that underscores this increasing tension between the two countries. Now, of course, in Australia as well, we are seeing more of a concerns from national security people. They are having more of a voice in the cabinet as opposed to the economists. So that's another angle to this as well.
Okay, so what you end up with, Katrina, and this is David's analysis, feel free to agree or disagree, is you've got the hawks in Canberra saying China is a uniquely dangerous country. They're attempting to infiltrate our democracy, our universities. They're asserting pressure on us and bullying us over trade. And when you see someone like Twiggy Forrest come out and say, well, maybe not, or the wine growers come out and say, hey, Canberra, you want to back off because now they've banned our wine, those other voices are seen as, oh, you're not interested in this country's national security, you're just putting profits before people. And so it's sort of, in David's view, sort of tamped down those voices in the debate. Do you feel that frustration in rural Australia?
Well, look, I think the Australian government is doing a good job in this space. I mean, you've got to look at the whole thing on balance. China introduced very heavy tariffs to the tune of $25 billion worth on Australian food and fibre. Now, a significant player in that was our wine market. 200% tariffs, literally overnight, is a big disruptor for small businesses, majority of small businesses, exporting high-cost red wine to China. That was their market, and then suddenly it's disappeared. So I think that they have every right to have an opinion in this space. I mean, the other one, of course, was barley, which the Prime Minister of the Australian government has taken to the World Trade Organisation. And, of course, China said it was anti-dumping tax, that they were accusing Australia of dumping barley at a cheap cost into their markets, which Australia, of course, vehemently denied. But look, the government's introducing a lot of legislation. The Australian government's introducing a lot of new legislation in the cyber security space to protect our sovereignty. I mean, there are lots of issues going on here, and I'm not going to say that one's right, one's wrong. We've got some fantastic Chinese students that come to our universities, and we love them, and a lot of Chinese history in Australia itself as well. So, we have to look at things in a very balanced way, I think, and there's no right and there's no wrong. But I'm certainly looking forward to reading this book.
But David, see, that's a very keen line, and maybe a lot of people watching tonight will say what the Prime Minister was saying today was a reaction to that rolling series of tariffs. Now, are you saying that maybe it's the other way around?
Well, in any debate like this, you can always take it back to the last thing that the other side has done that you didn't like. Now, I think actually the economic retaliation, coercion, call it what you will, I think it was a response to a whole suite of policy measures that had, leaving specific policies aside, had really been driven by this notion that China was a dangerous country, that business as usual with China could not continue. And that's the message that Australia has been exporting to the world. Now, there's only so long that you can treat a customer in that way before they decide to take their business elsewhere. I do just want to add, though, the point of this book is not about restoring Australia's trade balance or getting back in China's good books. I do think, though, that anyone whose livelihood has been impacted by this policy shift has the right to ask, has this sacrifice been worth it? Have the losses that I've incurred been for some more noble purpose? And my answer to that question is no.
But see,
my answer is...
It's not. It hasn't.
No.
Now, this is. You are not an apologist for anybody. You are a scholar who specialises in the Uyghur people, the
indeed,
Muslim minority in China, that some nations have described Beijing's treatment of them as genocide. So you're not in any way got rose-tinted glasses on.
When people talk about standing up for values in relation to China, I'm all for that. The question is, what exactly are these values? And I think that the question of opposing racism and Islamophobia in Xinjiang, the policies there, standing up for democracy in Hong Kong, these are all very worthy causes and causes that I support. But I see those things as quite different to the kind of policy agenda that's been advanced around China here in Australia, which has involved new security legislation, a military build-up that is increasingly explicitly aimed against China. That's led to things like a spike in anti-Chinese racism here in Australia. These are two very separate things, and in fact, I think the kind of values that we're talking about in relation to China, democracy, human rights, and so on, you know, I see those as, in fact, grounds to be quite critical of the direction of Australian policy on China, because I don't think it's driven by those kinds of values. I think it's driven by power politics and a desire to uphold an increasingly shaky US-led order in Asia.
So it's not that you don't think that there has to be something effective to do about Hong Kong's democracy,
yes,
or the mistreatment of Uyghur people, the torture and abuse of those people.
Absolutely.
It's just that you don't think that has anything particularly much to do with Australia's position at the moment.
No, I think a deterioration of US-China relations, China-Australia relations, a militarisation of East Asia, you know, all of these things, a Cold War situation is not going to help anyone suffering from repression inside China. That's an issue that we need to separate out and very firmly stand in solidarity with people who are copying it at the moment in Xinjiang or Hong Kong or elsewhere. But I don't believe that entails support for the kind of, you know, decades-long Cold War confrontation that certain people in Washington and Canberra are spelling out for us.
Yon, this expression Cold War keeps coming up again and again, and this notion of what are Australian values, and David interprets it as you have to be willing, particularly if you're from mainland China, if you want to express Australian values, to condemn Beijing somehow. And in fact, this happened to you. You went to Canberra to give evidence at a Senate hearing on issues affecting migrant communities, and Senator Erica Betts of Tasmania said to you, and I quote, "Can I ask each of the three witnesses, and you were one, to very briefly tell me if they are willing to unconditionally condemn the Chinese Communist Party dictatorship?" What did you say?
Yeah. Well, obviously, it later turns out that he was only asked Chinese Australians that questions and not, you know, his own Prime Minister or anyone else. Somehow that Chinese Australians are expected to have a higher proof of innocence. Basically, there's the sense that we're all guilty until proven innocent, until we're coming out really hardline against the Chinese Communist Party. We're really never accepted as part of Australia, as a real Australian. But luckily, I think his antics has been widely condemned. Well, perhaps not by the government, but widely condemned in the society. So that is a really good thing to see. I just want to come back to what the Prime Minister said about the rules-based liberal order. I think, like many Australians, the Prime Minister really suffers from selective amnesia. He really looks back to the Cold War with such rose-tinted glasses. I think a lot of people in Australia has forgotten that the United States and its partners was overthrowing democratically elected governments in Iran, in Guatemala during the Cold War. That was used as an excuse to confront communism, and they were basically using a lot of illiberal means. And under this so-called rules-based liberal order, of course, the United States also invaded Iraq illegally under pretense, and is still, you know, in the Middle East, still involved in the Middle East, and it was right now supporting apartheid regime in Israel, despite its rhetoric about Uyghurs in Xinjiang, about spreading human rights abroad. So I think it's important to remember that there was actually never a liberal rules-based order to begin with. So there is no renewal, there is no going back there. But it is still important that we do strive for a rules-based order, because Australia is a middle power. And for middle powers, international institutions are really important because they constrain the great powers. So Australia should really try to rebuild, or to build actually, international institutions, including the World Trade Organizations, which has been suffering from pretty much at the brink of death due to actions by the United States. So this is what we really need to do. And I want to go back to another point about trade. I think it's quite interesting that even though we're so much at forefront of countering China, and other countries like the United States, Canada, they're all saying, yes, Australia, please go and be at the forefront of countering China. They are the ones that are benefiting from increased trade with China because what China is doing to us. So French winemakers, Canadian coal miners, they're the ones that's benefiting from loss of trade from Australia. So even though they were so gung-ho about this, you know, economic interest at the end is what dominates.
Justin, can I turn to you? I'm sorry, my watch is attacking me. I don't know how to make it stop. It's relatively new. Justin, what then? Okay, what Yun's talking about is realpolitik. Right? This is the way the world really is. Big powers and countries like China that want to be big powers have never really behaved by any set of rules. So, but I mean, you're in the business of human rights and human dignity. So what does a middle power about Australia do when confronted with the situation in Hong Kong, the evidence about Xinjiang? What do we do about that?
Obviously, we'd all want to make sure that human rights is upheld as best that it can at the highest level right across our planet. In every country, every nationality, and every region. I'd just say, and I don't have a lot to say on this, but as an Aboriginal man living and obviously being born and bred here in Australia, I think the Australian government needs to be very careful where they point the finger around who's upholding human rights or how their government is treating certain parts of their community. Here in Australia, it doesn't take much to have a look in our history, the report we just spoke about, the overrepresentation in so many of these areas, you know, the Aboriginal deaths in custody, there's a whole raft of life expectancy. So it'd be really good to be able to tidy someone's our own backyard up with their First Nations people, us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so we can lead by example and by action, other than just pointing and condemning what others are doing. And I think we'd have a far more better position to be able to have a mature conversation and diplomacy in this space to address. These are real issues, but we've got to make sure they are addressed. And I appreciate we can't have this turn into something saying that they're doing it for this purpose, but there's another underlying reason why it's being done, because that is even more injustice to the people that are being persecuted and that are on that receiving end of bad treatment.
Tasneem, David in the book asked the question, how do we reinforce our institutions so that our universities aren't vulnerable to anybody with money, whether they're from Beijing or anywhere else in the world, who want to have influence over what's taught? And how do we ensure that Chinese Australians, in fact all Asian Australians, don't get caught up, as the statistics show that they're starting to, in this sense of suspicion as hostilities between Australia and China, and this sharp language continues?
Yeah, I don't think it's just suspicion in terms of the way China is perceived in this conversation. I think it's a broader argument of that anti-Asian hate in general. But so, you know, with 12% of Australians, hail from an Asian background, and I think 1 in 5 Chinese Australians has reported experiences of anti-Asian hate and bigotry, in the last 12 months. That's a significant number that can't be ignored. And, the culmination of both the way that we perceive our relationship with China, along with the experience of COVID as well, have only amplified that angst and experience for them. So what we can do is, I think, based on the experiences that we know other minorities have endured in this country and continue to, be they First Nations, be they Muslims experience Islamophobia or other minorities, is to recognise that individuals should not themselves face the brunt of hostilities and vitriol which we associate with something that's much greater than them, in which this case might be our angst about particular policy or, the way a country is treating its minorities, for example, whether it's the Uyghur. So that distinction of being able to make the difference between the two is essential to the well-being of those communities, and recognising that, we have a vested interest in supporting our Chinese student population in our Chinese Australian population as well, because they are part of the fabric of who we are. And there's a lot to be learned from the experience of those who've come before them that continue to be vilified.
You give an
but
example.
Unfortunately, sorry, but unfortunately, the bilateral tensions has already spilled over on Main Street, right? People being called out for being. People were being accused of being a spy, or being a CCP sympathiser or apologist. These things are happening, and I think the media can do a better job for how it reports, for example, foreign interference. Quite recently, a lot of foreign interference cases are basically reported based on very flimsy evidences, such as connections to certain people, just because they appear in a photo together. Those are all taken as evidence of wrongdoing. And again, the government has not been strong on pushing the anti-racism message either, and basically was allowing people to be victimised for it.
Yeah. So let me ask you finally, David, I mean, you have a lovely example in the book about getting mainland Chinese students and Hong Kong students together in a seminar called Let's Talk About Hong Kong, which is interesting, and it's neither panic nor pandering. And they've talked to one another in ways that's what universities are about, opening your mind to other ideas you might not have had. But how the heck do you do that with foreign policy? Is there a way that Australia can neither panic nor pander to China?
Well, the title is hinting at a basic problem with our foreign policy, in that it does tend to be dominated either by business interests or by security interests. And they both have what I think are exaggerated images of China. China is our best friend that buys everything. China is a mortal enemy that's coming to get us. And I think we need to sort of open up the discussion a bit more, so that the instincts that I think most ordinary Australians share, that we want Australian policy to reflect concern for people who are suffering repression in foreign countries and so on, but we don't want a policy that is ratcheting up dangerous geopolitical tensions that could lead to war at the same time. I think that's actually a proposition that most Australians would go along with. The question is, how do we actually push that through to the policy level? And I think it is going to take ordinary Australians speaking up around this issue. And that's partly why I've written this book. It's not a policy manual for politicians. It's a book for ordinary Australians to get their head around a debate that's not going away anytime soon.
And fascinating. Thank you so much for coming in and telling us about it.
Thank you very much.
That's all we have time for. Thanks to everyone, to Katrina Hodgkinson, to David Brophy in tonight, to Jiang in Canberra, Tasneem Chopra and Justin Mohammed. Have an excellent evening, and Julia will be back with you tomorrow night. Good night to you all.